Hello, and welcome to another episode of MetaViews, where we look at politics, technology, society, basically the big issues that tend to get lost in the grist mill that is the media. By MetaViews, really what we mean is the big picture, but in plural, big pictures. And today I'm really quite pleased to bring onto the show someone who I've kind of known indirectly for quite a while, and social media. I think we've been connected for well over a decade. But it's been a long time, Gavin, and a pleasure to bring you on. Gavin Dew is a British Columbian who's currently running for the leadership of the BC Liberal Party, and I thought that that would be an excellent excuse to bring Gavin on and talk politics. BC politics in particular, but global politics, social politics, environmental politics, technology politics, really whatever strikes you. And so I encourage folks, I'll give a brief, quick plug. I encourage folks to check out gavindew.ca, which is Gavin's campaign website. But of course, it also has a lot of information about Gavin, the human being, as well as links to his social media, which is how I have gotten to know him and learn about the work you do and the issues that you're interested in. So, let's start off our chat today really by looking at, what has drawn you to politics? And I say that almost in a bit of a tongue-in-cheek because as long as I've known you, you've been political. So allow me to frame that and say, what draws you to electoral politics and party politics in particular as the arena that you're currently choosing as a place to make a difference?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jesse. I think yes, since we've known each other, I've been engaged in politics, but I never grew up in it, right? I grew up listening to heavy metal and playing in heavy metal bands, and that was kind of where my interest in politics started. So from there, I gradually worked my way into actually being involved in the doing of politics. Uh, I've always been a business guy with a sideline in politics rather than a politics guy who occasionally did business. So for me, I got involved in politics. I got involved in doing campaigning. I would say the real inflection point for me was work that I started doing maybe about 13 years ago, when I started being very focused on trying to pull young professionals into the world of politics. Because, Jesse, you've seen this time and again, younger people think politics isn't for them. And it's one thing when you're in university and maybe your politics are very abstract, or you're mostly focused on American politics because that's what's on the news. It's another thing when you've got people that are, in their mid and their late 30s, they're business decision makers, they're, highly engaged and highly touched by politics because of, whether it's affordability, whether it's healthcare, whether it's the economy, and they still aren't engaged in politics. So that really has been my journey of the last decade, is being involved myself and trying to build a bridge to bring folks that really don't think of themselves as political into the political system. This is really the culmination of that. We're in a moment in BC where our political system hasn't had a lot of room for people who are kind of middle of the road, common sense, business oriented people who are looking to have a government that understands the 21st century economy that they are living in, the water they're swimming in, the environment they're doing business in. So that's what really drew me into elected politics or electoral politics at this moment.
Well, and let's take a brief tangent, partly because I'm from Ontario, and I sort of feel that the way in which British Columbia politics are depicted in Ontario is unnecessarily mediated. And yet there is a perception, like there's this phrase I've heard bandied about repeatedly, that in BC politics is a blood sport, that it's really kind of vitriolic, it's really passionate. And I think you're right that can alienate a lot of young people. It alienates people who are not themselves kind of already inside baseball or already kind of inside that political loop. So for those of us who don't live in British Columbia, can you give us a kind of meta view, as it were, of kind of how BC politics works and perhaps how it's different from politics in the rest of Canada, or to your point, the United States? Because I do think as Canadians, we take for granted how much of our perception of politics is shaped and framed by U.S. coverage, which is why as an Ontarian, I'm saying, hey, I admit I don't totally understand the nuances of BC politics.
Yeah, Jesse, that's a great question. I spent some time going back and forth to Ontario on business for about 3 years recently. And for me, it was the same. It was arriving in Ontario, and the same words mean different things. The Ontario Liberal Party and the BC Liberal Party are very different things. The political spectrum is different. The urban rural is different. In Ontario, I would say the federal government is much more of a present factor. Western alienation existed and exists for a reason. And that's that if you're out on the West Coast, the federal government is obviously, it's relevant, it's important, but it doesn't have that same centrality. So provincial government is perhaps much more influential, and the politics are really, really substantial there. The big thing to understand about BC politics is that for a long, long time, and this has changed a little bit, but for a long, long time, it's been much more starkly divided. Ever since, call it the 1930s, with the rise of the CCF, which became the NDP, there's really been two primary forces in BC politics. There's been the NDP and not the NDP. Mm-hmm. And not the NDP has, changed in terms of the names associated with it. Today, it's called the BC Liberal Party. For a while, it was called Social Credit. It would be more a coalition of federal Liberals and federal Conservatives, but not really defined by that. But that would be kind of how the spectrum breaks out. And then in addition, there's a Green Party that's been around for a long time, was irrelevant for a long time, became, as a movement, environmental politics became very significant in the mainstream of British Columbia, I would argue around 2009. When Greens exerted significant influence on the BC Liberal government of the time, which led to a revenue-neutral carbon tax and a very progressive environmental set of policies. I think that was the peak of Green influence in BC politics. Others would argue that 2017 was the peak, where you had almost a hung parliament, where you had a very tenuous balance of an outgoing BC Liberal government that effectively won the most seats in the election in 2017, but fell short by a couple. Then the NDP and the Greens made an agreement, a confidence and supply agreement, which led to what was not a coalition government, but sort of a coalition government for a period of 3 years, at the end of which the NDP turned around, stabbed the Greens in the back, and won themselves a majority government. So now we're in this fascinating moment where that middle of the road voter, that eco-capitalist, as I'd call them, that technophile, that folks who are tech entrepreneurs thinking about the future, I think that's a particularly important cohort of people. The 25 to 45-year-old folks working in the private sector, engaged with the economy, that cohort doesn't really know where to be right now. Because for many of them, philosophically, they're not necessarily NDPers, but they haven't necessarily felt as if there was room at the table for them in the BC Liberals. The Green Party, although there's great people there, have never really been a party that's going to form a government. So there's this interesting moment in terms of a generational turnover, a generational change.
Well, and it strikes me that, the Green Party as predominantly an issue-specific political party, that where it exists and where it is successful is because the other parties are not successfully addressing climate change. They're not as successfully addressing the environment. And if, as you're suggesting, if in British Columbia, as a unique, in part because of the beautiful landscape and the sensitive ecosystems, if environmental concerns are no longer partisan, rather parties debate the policies as to what should be the response, then to your point, it does undermine the purpose of the Greens, because all of a sudden the other parties are becoming literate or are becoming active on the environmental file, which then gives people an opportunity to, not just isolate their environmental policies, but align it with their economic views, align it with their political and cultural views. So I'm curious, to your point, What do you see as the key environmental issues that you can champion as potentially leader of the Liberal Party and not only steal away votes from the Greens, but potentially from the NDP as well, who historically, at least on the federal scale, have often successfully campaigned around climate change and the environment, but still alienated a lot of voters who fundamentally don't agree with the party? Do you see a political advantage in being environmental, but also having other policies that aren't associated traditionally with the NDP or the Greens?
Thanks. That's a great question, Jesse. I mean, I see a political advantage in being green, but I think it's also an existential imperative, right? We can't. I think it's a given, right? And I think increasingly you've really hit the nail on the head. That in marketing they talk about qualifiers and differentiators, right? If you're buying a car, a qualifier is it better have four wheels. Differentiator is cup holders and a backup camera. In Canadian politics, acknowledging and addressing anthropogenic climate change is a qualifier. Yeah. It's a given. So that has to be the case across the board. I believe that is the case in the party I'm running to lead, the BC Liberal Party. What it comes down to is what is the right approach, or what is the right balance of approach. So I like to talk about the idea that the BC Liberal Party can be the Green Party of yes, as compared to the Green Party of no. Because there are a couple of choices there around, philosophically, are you trying to do green by getting to no on things you don't like, or are you trying to do green by getting to yes on things you do like? So how can we as a jurisdiction be better around EV charging? How can we be better around enabling innovation on renewables? How can we be better? And this to me is something I'm really interested in. Let's recognize that we actually are, a finite scope of emissions in the world, but we're also really good at some things. So how can we export our leadership around, for example, small scale hydropower? It's an oversimple, trite example, but if you look at Nepal on the other side of the world, thousands of people are dying every year in Nepal because of indoor air pollution, because they're cooking over wood and yak dung fired stoves. And this is a country that has boundless reserves of potential hydropower and is located immediately north of India, where there's a high demand for power. And India is the biggest user of coal-fired power in the world.
Yeah.
Okay, we're really, really good at small-scale hydro here. We can have such a huge impact if we're successful at exporting our innovation to places where they can have massive, massive impact. Mm-hmm. And I think of that as being a way for us to strengthen our economy as well by taking our leadership, growing our leadership, investing in our leadership, exporting it. And, here's where I might differ from some folks who might be more orthodox Greens. I'm not afraid to use our traditional resource sector, acknowledge it's going to be there, and think about how can we reinvest from there. So, if we know that that oil is coming out of the ground, and we've been selling it in such a way that we're subsidizing the American economy, which is what we've been doing, then wouldn't you rather have those dollars and plow them back into innovation, plow them back into energy transition, plow them back into supporting the kinds of future energy that we want to have here? To me, that's the sort of green pragmatism that we need to embrace, in just acknowledging that symbolic political wins are nice, but we actually need to think about systems and structures and broad-based impact on a global level, because there's a global airshift.
And there's something really quite smart politically about focusing on the yes rather than the no, right? Because the yes sort of tells people that your instincts are correct. Your desire for more energy, your desire for a better living, your desire for a better quality of life, those are positive instincts, and we will help reward you with that. And then I like the global knowledge economy piece. Right? The idea that we have a certain privilege in Canada, both in terms of our standards of living, but also in terms of our natural resources, that if we've really put our efforts around responsible, sustainable, to your point about Nepal and the hydropower, there's ways in which you can empower humanity without destroying the planet. And that, unfortunately, is the path less traveled, because you have the greedy who go, let's just pillage and rape. And then you have the reaction, which is, no, we must do nothing. And unfortunately, it means that people tend to side with the pillage and raping because they want their electricity, right? They want to have their quality of life.
And Jesse, we just have to be honest about trade-offs, right? I mean, so look, I drive an electric vehicle. I switched over last year. I drive a Tesla. I love it. It is fantastic. I've gotten used to the new ecosystem around it. It's great, but it's not a papal indulgence. It doesn't save me from sin. The reality is I'm driving a car that requires a whole bunch of mining to go into it. It requires nickel and copper and aluminum. Great. Well, that's mining that has an environmental impact. The reality is that in British Columbia, we have a very high degree of green power. So I'm doing reasonably well in terms of how my car is powered. But if you're driving an electric vehicle in a jurisdiction that's using coal-fired power plants to generate electricity, then you're driving a coal-fired car.
Yeah.
Right. So, we do these mental shortcuts as humans because we want to simplify how we think about things. But we have to realize, there's a way this all fits together.
So this is a fantastic point that I hadn't planned to bring up, but I'll throw you a curveball because I think you're hitting the problem on the nose. How do we reintroduce nuance back into politics? Right? How do we have mature public policy debates that, are based on ecosystems, are based on principles where it's not binary, it's not this or that. It's if we introduce this, 10 things are changed. And if we do this, 20 things are changed. And, that requires a level of complexity and abstract thinking that I often am frustrated that our political culture can't accommodate. So it's really refreshing to hear you evoke that. So what is your strategy, both in terms of your leadership campaign, but also when you sort of imagine, past that, if you were leader, if even you were successful, if you were premier, how do you convey such complexity? How do you bring back such nuance in a political climate that seems to be going in the opposite direction?
Wow. I mean, that's an easy question, Jesse. It's not. It's a choice we have to make as a society. There's only so much that individual leaders can do. You can choose to set a tone. You can choose to try to frame your questions, frame your issues, frame your policies and ideas in such a way that is designed to try to bring people together rather than use wedge politics on them. That's a choice you have to make. And I'll be honest, it would be a heck of a lot easier for me to run for politics or to run for the leader of this political party by finding the wedgiest issue that I can wedge people on and then wedging away, right? I mean, that is unfortunately a very, very productive way of doing politics because it allows you to identify and mobilize people, on simple issues that feel black and white. I'm choosing to run a campaign that is deliberately framed around ideas, that is deliberately framed around people and families and ideas to help them, and is deliberately and aggressively trying to be about what I think government ought to be, right? Which is people-centered and also, for you and for folks that are listening to you, this is probably more central to their thinking than other people. It's about the 21st century economy, right? So it's how do we stop fighting yesterday's wars and start addressing challenges from tomorrow? In British Columbia politics, I'm going to be really honest with you. A lot of our politics of the last 30 years has been framed around basically a post-Cold War capitalism versus socialism battle. The frame in Canadian politics for a long time was about free enterprise versus socialism. And for 20 years, it was, we don't want the NDP 90s, don't go back to that. Mm-hmm. It's 2021 right now. And it's going to be 2024 by the time we're in another election. We have to be talking about the 21st century and about the problems that are coming down the pipe at us and actually have the capacity to address them. And that is climate change. It is geopolitical change. And it's the changing nature of work, in particular, skills biased, job dislocation, automation, virtualization, those kinds of changes. We need to make sure that, the way we become more constructive is we get more people into government and more conversation into government that are talking about, okay, let's get real. We're not fighting about the 90s anymore. We're having a constructive conversation about the reality that, a multi-billion-dollar industry in, say, long-haul trucking, as an example, in BC, is going to be disrupted by automation in 7 or 10 years. Well, what are we going to do about the thousands of people who are going to be affected? Right now, British Columbia, go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, I'll push back on that only because, we talk about this a lot. I think the impact won't be that those truckers are going to lose their jobs. I think that one trucker is going to be running a fleet of 10 trucks. So the question is, what is the state of rural BC highways? What is the
Yeah,
state
great
of the
question.
transportation links? But I don't really want you to answer that. The question I do want you to answer, which is relevant, is what about universal access to the internet and broadband affordability in British Columbia? Because BC has a unique geography compared to the rest of Canada. It has a tremendous rural population, but that rural population is often even more remote than the other main provinces, not the territories granted. But, you know, you get up into northern BC and there are some really far-flung communities. How do we ensure that they have the same internet access that you and I have?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jesse. And you know what? I'll double down on that and say this. We have a major dynamic happening. It's happening everywhere in Canada, but in BC, it's happening probably more so, I believe, from the statistics that I have seen. And that is that younger families are effectively fleeing urban British Columbia, right? They're
Yeah.
going to not just the suburbs, but they're going to exurban, rural, a variety of places looking for affordability.
Mm-hmm.
And the data, both the real estate data, the StatsCan data, and the opinion data suggests that, again, they're going there for affordability. They're going there with the expectation that they may work or contract back to cities. And their absolute tippy top priority is broadband internet, followed closely by hospital access. So how do we get that broadband happening? Part of it may be about building out, physical broadband structure, and part of it may be satellite.
Yeah.
Right. So, there's innovation coming. I'm not familiar with all of the companies and exactly where they're at stage wise on that front. But I mean, you can think about one of the great case studies of technology implementation is cellular telephony in sub-Saharan Africa. Right. So if you go to Kenya, there are many places where there were never phone lines,
Yeah.
ever. So
Yeah.
nobody went from I've got a phone line to I've got a cell phone. They went from I've got nothing to I have a cell phone.
The wireless is certainly a good stopgap, but you have to
Yeah,
factor in that the fiber optic connectivity in the lower mainland is what the entire web is going to develop for. And
totally agreed.
even though wireless may be the best thing you can get in Dawson's Creek or the best thing you can get in Prince George or Prince Rupert, in order for them to keep up. But another thing you said I kind of want to touch upon, because I forget this myself, is the expectation that these people migrating to rural communities have for transportation infrastructure.
Yes.
Right? They
Yes.
assume that they're going to be able to drive back into the lower mainland. They assume that they're going to be able to drive back into the town or the city that they're closest to. And like me, they might be fantasizing that it's in a self-driving vehicle or a Tesla on autopilot so they could sleep as part of the way. Is transportation infrastructure an issue in British Columbia? Is it aging? Is there issues in terms of servicing this migration shift, this population
Yes.
shift, because of the
Yeah.
expectation these people bring with them?
Jesse, you're absolutely bang on that issue. There's a couple of different transportation issues you've got to address. On the one hand, of course, you have rural transportation, you have the very issues you've just described, and you have people's expectations around what transportation is going to look like, self-driving vehicles, how that's all going to work. You also have urban transportation and mobility, and there, we've fallen a little bit behind. We got for complex political reasons that are not worth getting into. We sort of ended up stalled out on a bunch of transportation projects in the lower mainland of British Columbia, all of which are projects that I've done work on over the years and been very supportive of. We ended up having a transit referendum around the funding of those projects. It failed. Things got stalled. And to be perfectly honest, it contributed to the political loss of the party that I'm running to lead, which was, I think it felt in the perception of a lot of urban and suburban British Columbians like we'd given up on urban leadership, or we'd pulled back in terms of building out that infrastructure. So now there's setting partisan politics aside, there's just a need to get caught up because we were lagging anyway to begin with in terms of keeping up with growth, in terms of keeping up with the connectivity needs of the region. Because the reality is, yeah, who doesn't want to be in a self-driving electric vehicle going around in an individual pod? My guess is my kids who are 2 years old and 4 months old will never learn to drive with a steering wheel. That's very, very likely and very, very possible. But the reality is that although that might lead to improved utilization of existing roads, it is still going to imply a bunch more demand. And there still is going to be a very important necessity of having mass transit engaged along major arterial corridors, right? So knitting together that system of transportation so that you can hop onto, rapid rail from place A to place B, and then do your last 5 kilometers in a self-driving, Tesla on
Well,
Uber, if you will. We've got to catch up on that front.
and to your point, I mean, we shouldn't take the urban bias of thinking that public transit is only urban, right? There should be
Exactly.
rural public transit and inter a city interlocation. I mean, I know the track between Prince George and Prince Rupert has suffered some access issues in terms of the
Yes,
transportation
absolutely.
up there. I mean, is there an opportunity to kind of leverage some of what we've seen in the kind of sharing economy or gig economy and apply that to the realm of public transit, which allow me to roll that back and repack it up into a curveball? What role does the province, or what role does the public sector, could it play in facilitating the kind of matchmaking we've seen Uber and Airbnb play? Because we've had conversations on this show with public policy experts who sort of lament the lack of responsiveness of governments, that these are services governments could have provided had they had the digital skills, had they had the digital literacies. And instead, it was the private sector who filled the void. It was the private sector who saw the need and met the need. So to your point about government for the 21st century, about thinking forward in terms of addressing the needs of British Columbians, do you see a role in using technology in the public sector to enable this type of resource sharing and enable this type of matchmaking?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to curveball your curveball, Jesse. So, I mean, philosophically, I think you've touched on a really important debate, which is, should the government be in the business of innovation? Or is the government good at innovation? Generally speaking, governments aren't. What I think governments can be good at is setting the stage where innovation can happen. So, lamentably, British Columbia is a jurisdiction that took 7 years and 2 governments of 2 different political stripes to figure out how to regulate ride sharing. So, if the question is, could the government have done ride sharing better than the private sector? I think the answer is a resounding no. Right? We got
And
caught
I have
up
to
in.
admit, as an Ontarian, I forgot that in Vancouver, ride sharing was literally outlawed for a number of years.
Well,
Again,
yeah, it
here in
ended up.
Ontario,
Yeah,
we didn't have that. So I forgot that as a frame of reference.
exactly. So, I mean, to me, and that to me, like, look, there are downsides to Uber. Let's be clear, right? I mean, I personally, I like Uber, I use Uber, but you've got to recognize that there are issues around precarious work. There's all kinds of issues that are there. So don't take me as just saying, "Yay, Uber," and ignoring issues that come with it. But at the same time, for 7 years in British Columbia, we created a situation where for taxi drivers and for taxi license holders, there was uncertainty for 7 years. 7 years of not knowing, okay, what's going to happen here? Is my license going to be extinguished? Is my job going to exist? And for 7 years, we said to Uber and Lyft and others, maybe we'll let you come in, maybe we won't. The signal that sent to the marketplace was, if you're going to do something innovative, do it somewhere else. Don't come here. So now, if you're talking about electric vehicle infrastructure, if you're talking about any form of private sector investment that is going to lead to consumer benefit, you're going to think twice about going to the jurisdiction where it took 7 years. You could
And
get a ride share in Mogadishu before you could do it in Vancouver.
And that's where I'd push back and say I think that is why government innovation is important. I think there's a
Yes.
larger political debate as to the role of the public sector versus the private sector, but everybody wants a government that's competent. And
Oh yeah.
everybody
Oh
wants a
yeah.
government that is at least in a position to decide what it needs to do without having to take 7 years to do it. So I
Exactly,
think that's
Jesse.
where
So
we
it's
agree.
government. It's government frame setting, right? Like, it's government being innovative in the way that it establishes a framework within which, ideally, in my viewpoint, it's establishing a framework within which private sector risk capital can be invested and benefit can be delivered, right? So, should government be in the business of building out the code for the next Uber? No, but government should be in the business and should have the capacity, the capability, and the currency to understand this is the 21st century. This is
Yeah.
where we're going.
Yeah.
These are the kinds of
And
questions we need to ask.
And to your point, I think a very 21st century move for a government to do would be to sit down and say, hey, you Uber, let's sit down and talk. Hey, you Lyft, let's sit down. Like, to actually convene that conversation, right? In a kind of public setting that not only allows the industry to weigh in on what they want, but then gives the public an opportunity to weigh in
Yes.
on what they want. And I think to your point, the government not being able to do that not only delegitimizes the government, but it tells innovation, go look elsewhere, which hurts everybody.
Exactly. And the ride sharing issue was just a big public, it was a visible symbolic manifestation. There was a lot of complex political issues to it. We could spend an hour on alone. But the key is, I believe that what we need is a 21st century government that has people in it who understand business, understand innovation, understand technology, and as a result are able to understand the political implications of these kinds of changes and try to make sure that we're being compassionate and forward looking. So we're not waiting 10 years and then having a political shit fight over whether or not you should be allowed to have an automated long haul truck.
Well,
we should be realizing it's coming and figuring out the positive and negative implications.
And that's a fascinating point, which I'm going to use to loop back with something we mentioned earlier. That the other negative side of our current political culture is politicians have an incentive to ignore pressing issues. Right? Like it's in their vested interest to not deal with anything controversial unless they have an easy solution and unless they have a win. I mean, it's why things like healthcare, it's why things like the sharing economy get deferred until they become crises, rather than your point being proactive, being anticipatory. So with that said, I want to tie that back to our earlier point about nuance, right? That politics lacks a kind of nuance. It especially for issues like climate change, it requires a much more informed debate, especially if we are going to juxtapose options and we're going to talk about different ways of addressing it. So that's why I thought it was interesting that you're calling for an inquiry into the pandemic. And British Columbia, again, has been much different than the rest of Canada, partly because the nature of your geography means, in theory, it's easy to isolate. But you also had that huge P1 outbreak at Whistler, in the sense that you also, like Ontario, have a lot of international travel and a lot of links to the world, which has made this pandemic difficult to manage. So given that the debate around the pandemic lacks nuance, right? That it's very polarized, that it's full of really extreme reactions and extreme positions. I think we must have some kind of, reflection, inquiry, royal commission. Like there has to be some assessment of what we did wrong and what we need to do better next time. So a two-part question. What do you think? Why are you calling for that inquiry, and what do you think it should focus on? And the second part, how do we ensure that it remains level-headed? How do we ensure that such a process actually gets to viable answers rather than become a hothouse of political conflict and conspiracy?
Well, yeah, Jesse, you're asking the exact right questions in my view, right? So why should we have an inquiry? I think in the short term, in a British Columbian context, I called, and I was the first person to call for an inquiry in BC. I did so in a context where there were a series of episodes that I think really shook people's faith in the response that was being undertaken. So the most, there was effectively what amounted to a Hunger Games scenario where you had these random pop-up vaccination stations being erected with no notice and no communication in communities that were highly affected. And you literally had people learning about their existence via rumor and WhatsApp message rather than any communication coming out of government. So you had people, running and driving willy-nilly across the lower mainland of British Columbia in the hopes they might be able to get a vaccination, lining up for 8 hours. And, in these lines, you had, for example, South Asian seniors who were of an age that suggested they should have been vaccinated 2 months earlier, but there'd been a failure to communicate to them in language or in a culturally appropriate way, lining up. In some cases, you had, vulnerable seniors. You might have had disabilities or might have otherwise had, mobility challenges in this giant lineup. No ability to process or fast track people that should have been vaccinated already. No consideration given to just the ridiculously, frankly, insulting nature of this for the South Asian community in Surrey, who were, being, what they were seeing is on the other side of the region. People are having 15-minute windows lined up at pharmacies to get vaccination, and we're being asked to line up like we're in a third world country. So there was a tremendous degree of affront caused in that community. What became apparent shortly thereafter, as a result of some data leaks from the BC Centre for Disease Control, was the extent of information that was not being disclosed to the public, and which included information that frankly could have helped to reduce the spread in neighborhoods. Obvious information, which for reasons that are baffling, simply wasn't being disclosed. So you have a combination of the actual treatment of the pandemic, combined with a series of failed economic support programs that were rolled out with incredible levels of clumsiness, and that likely wasted money and led to the loss of a number of businesses and some major challenges because they were just so poorly thought out. So in one way, I was reacting to the real public frustration around both the health measures and the economic measures. But more broadly, and this touches on your second question, Jesse, this is the crisis of our times. There is no question. This is the crisis of our times. This is of a magnitude of historical memory for a generation comparable to 9/11, right? When you think about just moments in the history of a generation, and there is an incredible amount of learning that we can and should be doing from this. When you talk about crisis management, there's a model of crisis which talks about resiliency and crisis. So the more crisis you go through, it's like working out. You break down your muscles of reaction, you build them up, and you make them stronger. And you push out the threshold from routine operations to routine crisis to novel crisis, unanticipated crisis. The more resiliency you build, the better you are at handling crises, no matter what they may be. So we need to learn from this because it won't be the last crisis of the 21st century.
Well, and to your point, to extend that metaphor into the mental health realm, when you experience a trauma, if you don't process that trauma and work that trauma out, you're just going to keep repeating it, right?
That's
and you're
exactly
just
it,
gonna
Jesse.
keep acting out that trauma rather than learning what you need to learn and adapt. And this pandemic was traumatic for everybody. And if we as a society don't learn from it, then we're going to keep acting out the things that have hurt us, the things that have impacted.
Exactly. And the reason why I called for a commitment to an inquiry, I'm not saying, look, start it tomorrow. What I'm saying is we need people on all sides of government and opposition, to commit unanimously to an apolitical inquiry that is designed to seek truth. The reason we need to have that conversation now is that as we move from pandemic response to economic recovery, I think there's going to be this moment of irrational exuberance where it's ding dong, the witch is dead, we can get on with our lives. And there will be a logical, fair, I don't begrudge people just wanting to move on and get back to business, get back to their lives, get back to seeing their friends and family. It would be tempting and easy for us to just move on and not look backward, not learn the lessons, not build the capacity we could build. And that's why I started the conversation about a pandemic inquiry now, not 6 months from now.
Yeah, and I think to your point, that's just not going to happen. I think people underestimate that politics as we know it has changed, that
Absolutely.
People's trust in institutions has plummeted, and that in BC, right, an election in 2024 is a little ways off. I suspect we're going to see a federal election before that. And I think politics in general is going to be notably different. I'm not saying good or bad. I'm just saying different. So allow me to use that as a transition to focus on the nuts and bolts of, I'm assuming you're in it to win it. So what do you see as your path to victory? What is, and it's an early day. What is it? Next February is the...
Yeah, it's a long process.
It's a marathon. Yeah. What is your kind of strategy? How do you see the path to victory lining up for your campaign?
That's a great question, Jesse. So, I see that on two components, right? There's a supply side and a demand side of the equation, right? So let's start with the demand side. Let's start with where we are as a province and as a party. So, for anyone who follows British Columbian politics, and there's probably not that many people on your show who do, but, there was an election in 2017 where the BC Liberal government at the time was defeated narrowly. And at that time, we had a choice. We could either hang on to the idea that, it's really close. We just need a couple thousand more votes in a couple of ridings, and we'll be back in government, and it'll be back, like it used to be. Or we need to renew, modernize our party, broaden our coalition, adapt to the new reality on the ground in terms of the changing demographics, the changing nature of the electorate. And we ended up choosing the former. Right. We ended up not really doing the hard work of renewal because I don't think we were ready to process, the trauma of loss. We were not ready to come to terms with the fact that we needed to go away and renew and modernize ourselves. After the last election, which was in the fall of 2020, we were dealt a much bigger defeat. We lost quite substantially. We lost seats that we had never lost, in a generation in places we thought of as strongholds. And we saw the electoral map just change on us. And a huge part of that change was young, urban and suburban working professionals with middle of the road values, people who care about the environment, people who expect a measure of social justice, people who are, very comfortable in multicultural environments, very comfortable with the LGBTQ community. Those folks all of a sudden just weren't with us, where we hadn't really built the bridge to that next generation of our political base, which, if we're honest, is generally a private sector oriented, entrepreneurially oriented voter. But all of a sudden, I was going to say,
the left-right split in BC is different from the rest of the country because, here in Ontario and Alberta, there are social conservatives, right? There are a lot of social conservatives who will vote based on those social issues. Whereas it strikes me in BC, the main difference between left and right is the difference between public versus private sector, right?
That's a fair statement, Jesse.
That the left very much feels that the public sector should be the biggest player in the economy, and the right feels that the private sector should be the biggest player in the economy, which to your point means, making sure that the Liberal Party is inclusive to different communities and different identities that are not socially conservative or are not aligned with traditional conservatives, but do feel strongly about the role of the private sector and do feel very strongly about the role of an active marketplace and a competitive marketplace.
Exactly, Jesse. So, the kinds of things that would concern most BC Liberals in BC, as an example, is that over the last 14 months of COVID, the private sector is down, was down massively, is currently down 2-3% in terms of jobs across the country. In British Columbia, public sector payroll has grown 10.3% in 14 months. That's 4 times the rate of growth of Ontario. So that's a massive enlargement in government. Right now, half of that is specifically in the health sector, and we certainly have needed more people for health response. That's appropriate. I don't think anyone would begrudge that. But the question will be, is that a short-term surge? Does that become a long-term embedded, issue? Certainly, I don't begrudge people having jobs, and there's very important work that our public servants do, to be clear. But that debate over the role of the public sector versus the role of the private sector, that debate over kind of the nature of business, I would argue the difference between kind of the NDP and not the NDP is that I'll give the NDP good marks for intentions on a wide variety of things. Execution, especially when it comes to executing things that require an understanding of how people make decisions in a market economy, has not historically been their area of strength.
And let me ask a quick technical question. What's the voting system like for leader? Like, is it one member, question. One vote? Is it balanced based on ridings? Is it, ranked ballots? What is the technical basis of the contest?
You bet. It's a ranked ballot system with points assigned by riding. There are 87 constituencies in British Columbia. Every one of them is worth 100 points, and the entire system works on a ranked ballot. So it's no secret to anybody that the tried and true tactic for winning a leadership race in that context, just as it would be federally, is to actively pursue support in ridings your party currently does not hold.
Yeah. And so, I mean,
So
the other question that follows up on that is given the, geographic diversity of British Columbia, right? I mean, this is, a province that's larger than most countries and has, desert and rainforest, mountains and like you've got it all. How do you connect with all those constituencies? How do you build a campaign that is active in all those constituencies?
yeah, great question, Jesse. And you know what? The interesting thing is this. In some ways, COVID has obviously been very difficult for this leadership campaign, even at the outset. You can't see people in person. That sense of personal connection, that handshake, that 3 minute aside at the on the sidelines of an event that really that's the meat and potatoes of politics.
Yeah.
That's not there,
Yeah.
and that is a real loss. On the other hand, everybody, not everybody, but most people now have a Zoom account. They've gotten comfortable with doing video chat. COVID has forced 5 or 7 or 10 years of technological process down all of our throats, for positive and for negative. I mean, it's also brought on the storefront apocalypse in terms of retail and restaurant.
But to your point, do you think that kind of levels the playing field in the sense that all candidates are basically restricted in the same way? So therefore, because someone who has a private plane who can fly to all these communities, they no longer have an advantage in the sense that you're all on the internet and you're all competing and trying to sign up new members to the party and reach out to existing party members.
Yeah, Jesse, I think you're right. I think that actually quite honestly plays to the advantage of somebody like me. I am substantially the youngest candidate in the leadership race. I'm a digital native with a digitally native campaign team. Most of the new voters that I would be looking to onboard, the easiest folks for me to reach are young, digitally native, multicultural suburban parents, if you will. So, that's very advantageous for me. And then equally, frankly, a lot of people who might be in more rural areas of the country have all gotten used to doing video conferencing. So although we all have Zoom fatigue, we all have Zoom.
Yeah.
So it's easy for me to go on a given day. I might switch from, being on a call or a Zoom with someone who's in Fort St. John, in northern BC to someone who's in downtown Vancouver. So that does, although the level of depth of contact might be diminished, the breadth of contact and the speed of contact is significantly increased.
Well,
and I do think that plays very well for a candidate like myself.
And I was sort of leading up to the hardball question or the fastball question, because at this point in a leadership campaign that is as long as it is, I have to ask the money question, right? What's your fundraising strategy? And to what extent, not just for you, but for all the candidates, to what extent is the campaign a direct reflection of how much funds you can raise versus do you feel the internet helps mitigate against that? So you don't need, because again, I'm assuming that in a traditional campaign, your money goes to things like travel, given how far spread the province is, and then potentially staff, right? To have people on the ground in all the very many communities. So 2-part question. What is your fundraising strategy? Do you feel confident that you're going to be able to meet your goals and wage what is basically a very long campaign? And second, is that mitigated by the internet in terms of either making it easier for you to raise money because you are making all these digital connections, or makes it easier for you to do more with less because of the way in which the internet, say, cuts travel costs?
Yeah, those are good questions, Jesse, and they really fit together. So you know what? I'll be honest. I won't be the big money candidate in this race. I won't be the guy with the biggest war chest. I won't be the guy getting the most max donors. That is not my candidacy. Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty okay with that. I think it's really important for our party. For history and background, you'll know that in Ontario and federally, there was a shift away from kind of corporate fundraising to more individual fundraising, both federally and subsequently provincially in the province of Ontario. Those were major changes. Parties have had to adapt. We went through that change in BC politics a few years ago. And, my political party, the BC Liberals, are still digesting that change and still building out our small dollar individual fundraising prowess, for lack of a better way of putting it. So I see this as an opportunity for us to trial run doing more of that small dollar fundraising. The folks that are the easiest for me to reach based on who I am and on who I'm trying to bring into the party. Well, most of us are paying mortgages and rent and diapers and daycare, right? The maximum an individual can donate is $1,268.07, which is $1,200, and an inflationary factor. The fact of the matter is many of the people that I'm getting donations from are small donations.
Yeah.
So I'm focused on the individual small donor, folks that are drawn to the ideas that I'm putting out around how to help people and families. There are certainly people who are, longtime supporters of the party that are making donations. I think that I have hopefully a unique ability to reach into, the tech sector, to a newer generation of younger kind of business leaders and entrepreneurs who are looking for somebody who reflects them.
And you've sort of said this indirectly, so I just want to double down. Do you feel that your path to victory is through new members, is through signing up new people and bringing new blood? Because I think it is significant that you're the youngest candidate by far. And so do you see, the flag of renewal, the flag of rejuvenation as being part of your path to victory?
Yeah, I would say yes, but I'll nuance what you've said just a little bit. I think that there are really two components of the path. The first is bringing in new members, right? It's bringing in the incremental new member who probably, in my case, is likely to be a young multicultural suburban professional or a young person living in any community in British Columbia. Those are the voters that I am most likely to reach that another candidate, we have great candidates in this race, to be totally clear, just demographically and in terms of our key focus. Those are the folks I am most likely to reach. But it's also really important that I'm able to go out and engage pre-existing members. What I think people underestimate is this. The people in BC and across Canada who are most likely to say it's time for young people to step up and lead in politics are older people. I'm 100% serious on that.
Oh, right? You're right. So, I'm laughing because you are hitting the chord. Like 100% that's the case.
So the response that I've been getting, frankly, is you have a lot of folks who might be 70 and they might have been involved in politics for 30 or 40 or 50 years. They recognize the need for our party to renew. And I can tell you, for example, it's no secret people do opinion research when they're about to run political campaigns. One of the most striking results from the research that we did is that 92% of BC Liberal voters say that when it comes to picking a new leader, we need to look to the future, not the past. So there is this overwhelming appetite for renewal, for moving forward, for turning the page, new things, new ideas, new energy, new people, all of that. And that is across the board. So I don't think I'm tilting at windmills with just the new member. I think that the longtime membership, the longtime base of our political party is very, very aware today of the need for us to be renewed and revitalized and to have new energy and new ideas.
So then let me ask my last question, because we're running out of time. If there was, pretend that I'm a genie and pretend that I am a mischievous genie. So, if there was one thing you could wish for that you feel would make the difference in terms of not just for your campaign, but for BC politics in general, right? To be both selfish and altruistic at the same time, because that is fundamentally what makes a great politician, right? Is they have their own instinct and desire for self-preservation while aligning that with the public good, and that's why they end up being the leader. So if there's one thing that you could wish for you and potentially for BC politics that you think would make the difference in your campaign, what would it be? And it could be anything.
Wow. Let me be a little philosophical about this. I think that the reason I am running is twofold. On the one hand, I believe that my political party needs to build a bridge to the next generation, right? And realistically, that means the kind of, it's everybody from the first time voter upward, but realistically, that's probably about the 25 to 45-year-old who's kind of a little bit up and running in their career. That's probably the key voter that we need to be focused on. So I believe my political party needs to do a better job of building a bridge to that voter. But I also believe that voter needs to get profoundly more engaged. And I believe that that voter needs to regain hope because, like, it's also about that voter asserting themselves within the political system. Because, in fact, right now, if you're under 45 and you work in business as an entrepreneur anywhere in the private sector in BC, you have very little representation in any party. So to me, there's something broad and philosophical about a need to kind of restore hope and restore the dream and get that cohort of people back on track and feeling a sense of ownership and engagement in our society. Because there is a profound sense of alienation, which I think is driven in part by issues around housing affordability, childcare. There's a whole range of issues where on the one, the very people that should be the base of my political party, the next generation of our base, that cohort of people is really feeling very alienated, not only from our party, but also from the system as a whole. So the reason I'm doing this is that I worry about that cohort. Because it's not just that we lose elections if we don't get them, it's that we lose the vitality of our province, right? If that new young family decides, I can't make it here, I just cannot make it work here, we can't afford to be here, we can't get the job we're looking for, and they decide to pick up sticks and go to Toronto, or they decide to pick up and go to Calgary, or they decide to pick up and go anywhere else, we lose them. And if by the same token, the young entrepreneur who's thinking, I want to start a company, wait a second, I'm not going to start a tech company here because I can't hire people because they can't afford to live here, right? If we lose that young family, or if we lose that young striver, that young entrepreneur, we lose our vitality as a province. So to me, if I had a genie and a magic wand, it would be about reinstilling hope and connection and a sense of belief in that cohort, because that's why I'm doing this.
Right on. That's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you very much, Gavin. I thought this was a fantastic conversation.